Ever since Russia began reveling in the revelation that it has hypersonic missiles, or so Russia claims, that high-speed threat has been held over every other country's heads. Hypersonic missiles move so blazingly fast that today's air defenses can't stop them, and Russia claims to have missiles that are capable of reaching the US. That couldn't stand. Now the US has come roaring back with a hypersonic threat of its own. Vladimir Putin is shocked as the US unveils a new weapon that can hit Moscow in minutes. The Kremlin's ace in the hole just got buried as America reveals that it's ready to match Russia in the hypersonic weapon department. On December 15th, lethality reported on a visit made by US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth to Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. The base, which is the new headquarters of US Space Command or SpaceCom, became the venue that the US used to reveal that the Eagle has landed. Specifically, the Dark Eagle, otherwise known as the long-range hypersonic weapon, has not only been completed, but has entered production. The new missile was presented during a show-and-tell tour of US Army missiles conducted by Lieutenant General Francisco Lozano, who serves as the Director of Hypersonic, Directed Energy, Space and Rapid Acquisition. Lozano revealed some key details about the Dark Eagle's capabilities, which we'll get to in a few minutes. However, one of the key details to emerge from the tour is that the Dark Eagle missile that Hegseth saw isn't some prototype still being worked on. The US Secretary of Defense asked about the missile's production rate, leading Lozano to reveal that the missile's manufacturers are building Dark Eagles at a rate of 1 per month, and that they have plans to bump this up to 2 per month. That means an annual production rate of 12 to 24 of these missiles. It's not a lot, but it's a solid start for a country that has fallen behind Russia and China in the hypersonic race. The US will be happy to hear this, as there are several types of targets that it could strike with a new hypersonic weapon that is capable of traveling great distances in minutes. Enemy air defense systems are clear targets, lethality says, as almost nothing that any country can field is capable of shooting down hypersonic missiles, meaning the Dark Eagle may be used as an advanced weapon that clears the aerial pathway for other missiles to follow. Dark Eagle could also be used to strike sensor complexes, command and control nodes, and almost any location where troops gather due to the wide spread of its kinetic impact. So we know how quickly Dark Eagle is being built and what it might be used to hit, but what can the missile actually do? The Warzone, or TWZ, detailed everything that we learned about America's latest missile during Hegseth's tour, starting with the basics about how the missile actually works. Dark Eagle is a trailer-launched hypersonic missile, which automatically means that it should have a speed in excess of Mach 5 or 5 times the speed of sound. Such weapons are also designed to combine their crazy speeds with erratic movements as they fly through the Earth's atmosphere, with that potent combination making hypersonic missiles incredibly difficult to both track and destroy. As for the Dark Eagle specifically, Lozano placed most of his focus on the new US missile's range. Hegseth learned that the Dark Eagle can travel up to 3,500 kilometers, or around 2,175 miles, which is more than enough to place Moscow in the missile's range, assuming it's fired from the right location. Lozano says that Dark Eagle would have to be stationed in London for it to hit Moscow, suggesting that the US may be intending to cooperate with its NATO allies and international partners to turn its first hypersonic missile into a global threat. Lozano also said that the missile could hit China from Guam and Iran from Qatar. Is the US planning on building a Dark Eagle network? We don't know for sure, though it seems like a wise decision for a country that maintains somewhere in the region of 750 military bases across 80 countries, per Al Jazeera. Those bases exist for the express reason of allowing the US to project power all over the world. So it isn't a major leap to assume that America is planning to stock as many of these bases as possible with a new hypersonic missile it can use to intimidate US enemies. Interestingly, Lozano's revelation about Dark Eagle's range contradicts past reports about the missile's capabilities. As TWZ notes, the reveal of Dark Eagle hasn't come out of the blue. The US has been working on its new missile for several years and had previously claimed that it had a range of about 2,775 kilometers or 1,725 miles. That range has been boosted considerably, which TWZ says suggests one of two things. It isn't clear if the Army's own figures have changed based on the evolution of the weapon and its testing, or if the previous figure was watered down intentionally, which is common when it comes to official metrics for missile systems. Why the US might purposefully water down its missile specifications isn't made clear by TWZ. It may be that weapons manufacturers take the under-promise and over-deliver route when in the design phase, allowing them to impress when their weapon is completed. Or the US may know the true specifications from the start, and it hides them purposefully so as not to clue in its enemies into the true capabilities of what it's gearing up to unleash on the world. Or as TWZ says, Dark Eagle may have been improved organically since its original range was revealed. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that the missile doesn't pack the kind of punch that you might be expecting from the weapon that is leading the US charge into the hypersonic arena. An unnamed army officer at the show and tell event informed Hexeth that Dark Eagle will carry a warhead that weighs under 30 pounds, or about 13.6 kilograms. When compared to much older missiles, this warhead doesn't seem all that impressive. For instance, a Tomahawk cruise missile has a warhead that weighs over 33 times as much as the one loaded into the Dark Eagle, which might lead you to think that Dark Eagle is going to be all sizzle and very little steak if it's ever used. But all is not as it seems. The same officer told Hexeth that this warhead is really just a vehicle for ensuring that Dark Eagle gets its projectiles out, TWZ reports. The real damage is done by the missile itself, which is capable of delivering a powerful kinetic punch that covers a range roughly equivalent to the size of the parking lot at the Spacecom base. That doesn't give us a lot to go on, as the size of the parking lot is unknown. According to Tetra Tech, the requirement analysis conducted on the Redstone Arsenal base suggested that the base would need 300,000 square yards, or about 0.096 square miles of space for parking and roadways. But even that number isn't as much use as it could be, as it combines the parking lot and roads at the base. Perhaps we can assume that the Dark Eagle's area of effect is roughly half a square mile. That's still much more impressive than you might expect from a missile that carries a 30-pound warhead. TWZ also expands on the missile's potential destructive force, stating, "The kinetic punch this weapon provides will contribute more to its destructive power than a conventional warhead mounted in the tight confines of the conical boost glide vehicle." It also mentions that the Army officer who revealed the warhead's size also suggested that Dark Eagle could house a blast fragmentation warhead. That would also expand the missile's area of effect and could help to damage soft targets such as radar arrays and air defense batteries. We'll come back to this warhead issue later in the video. It's led to question marks being raised about the potential lethality of Dark Eagle in the past. Coming back to the new missile specifications, the last thing we learned about Dark Eagle is that it's capable of covering its full 2,174-mile range in about 20 minutes. That doesn't tell us precisely how fast Dark Eagle is, though anybody can tell that it's extremely fast. However, some quick maths allows us to get a bead on how quickly Dark Eagle flies through the sky. 1 mile per minute is roughly equivalent to Mach 0.078. Based on its range and 20-minute flight time, Dark Eagle achieves a speed of 108.7 miles per minute. That amounts to 8.5 times the speed of sound, which means the missile more than meets the Mach 5 milestone needed to be classified as hypersonic. It exceeds that milestone by 3.5 times the speed of sound. Earlier we also mentioned that the version of the Dark Eagle presented during Hexeth's tour isn't a prototype, as evidenced by the new missile being in production. Further proof of that fact actually came in 2024, which is when Defense Matters reported that the US Army and US Navy conducted a pair of successful end-to-end test flights of America's new hypersonic missile. The first of those flights saw Dark Eagle fly from Hawaii and across the Pacific Ocean to an undisclosed location. The missile was then tested with a launch from Florida's Cape Canaveral, presumably taking flight somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. Defense Matters said in 2024 that it appeared Dark Eagle was moving from testing to early fielding. That suggestion has proven true if Hexeth's tour teaches us anything. Interestingly, the same outlet also made a point upon which we speculated earlier in the video. European deployment discussions are real, but have centered on a 2026 window and on a mix of systems. A firm public US announcement that Dark Eagle batteries will be stationed in Germany by end of 2025 has not been issued. Lozano's mentions of launch points in places like London make more sense in that context. We may even see Dark Eagle deployed throughout NATO nations inside Europe, which would make the missile a clear counter to the hypersonic missile threat that Russia increasingly poses. That brings us to the key question that has to be answered now that we know that Dark Eagle is real, seemingly operational, and in production. What does it mean for the global military landscape now that Dark Eagle is ready to take flight? We mentioned Russia a moment ago, and it's the natural starting point for any discussion related to the US and its hypersonic weapons development program. The entire reason that a weapon like Dark Eagle exists in the first place, and why Lozano made a point to say that the missile could hit Moscow from London, is that Russia has traveled a lot further along the hypersonic missile development path than the US. It's one of the few areas in which Russia can legitimately claim to be more advanced than the United States, and Russia has even utilized plenty of hypersonic missiles during its war with Ukraine. That threat has to be taken seriously, as The Independent said as far back as March 2023. In an article covering Russia's advances with hypersonic missiles, the outlet said that such missiles represent a massive challenge for Ukraine's air defenses. It noted that an airstrike that Russia conducted during March 2023 was both the latest in a series designed to damage Ukraine's infrastructure and seemingly the first to combine Russia's cruise missiles with its hypersonic missile. Specifically, Russia launched its Kinzhal missile, which is one of the supposedly invincible weapons that Putin claimed were in production in Russia in 2018. Russia had about 40 of these missiles at the time of its March 2023 attack on Ukraine, based on NATO estimates, and it used 6 of them as part of a barrage of 81 missiles. More have been launched since, and Ukraine has faced constant challenges in bringing them down before they crash into the infrastructure and cities that Ukraine needs to defend. China is also well ahead of the US when it comes to hypersonic missiles. The BBC pointed that out in an August report in which it mentioned that China unveiled its Dongfeng hypersonic missile back in October 2019. Those missiles have been upgraded several times since, the BBC says. Granted, they haven't seen combat use as Russia's Kinzhal missiles have, but both the Kinzhal and Dongfeng show that Russia and China decided to invest heavily in hypersonic missiles long before the US did. Some in the US recognized the problem fairly early. In May 2023, the US Department of Defense website published a piece covering Air Force General Glenn D. Van Herk's testimony before the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Strategic Forces. Van Herk was discussing the 2024 fiscal year, and he placed his focus on something called the Future Years Defense Program. Hypersonic weapons were high on his agenda, as he revealed to the subcommittee. Hypersonic weapons are extremely difficult to detect and counter given the weapon's speed and maneuverability, low flight paths, and unpredictable trajectories, the general said, before adding that the US had made a mistake by allowing Russia and China to get so far ahead. I believe the greater risk for the United States stems from our inability to change at the pace required by the changing strategic environment, Van Herk said. The general seems to have a point, at least if an August 2025 report into hypersonic missiles is anything to go by. Published by Army Recognition, that report plainly stated that there are no existing air defenses that can reliably destroy hypersonic missiles in flight, meaning that every nation that could be targeted by a country that has hypersonic missiles faces a threat that it can't counter. There are some radars capable of tracking these missiles, including the US-made ANTPY-2 and the SPY-6. However, tracking doesn't equal elimination, especially of a missile that moves faster than anything that current air defenses can fire at. Again, Russia and China were brought up. The inability to intercept hypersonic ballistic missiles is exacerbated by the rapid development of these weapons by such nations as Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, Army Recognition says. Russia has already deployed hypersonic systems like the Avant-Garde glide vehicle and the Kinzhal missile, which have been touted as capable of evading all known missile defense systems. Dark Eagle being unveiled doesn't solve this air defense problem. The missile isn't going to be fired at other hypersonic missiles in flight. But what it does is bring the US closer to being on a level playing field with the likes of Russia and China. Close but not quite there yet, as Russia's hypersonic missiles are combat-proven. The Kinzhal is also more impressive than the Dark Eagle, assuming everything that has been learned about the missile is true. Missile Threat notes that Russia's hypersonic weapon has a range of up to 2,000 kilometers or about 1,242 miles. Though that's substantially shorter than the Dark Eagle's range, the Kinzhal makes up for this one shortcoming with a warhead that weighs 480 kilograms or around 1,058 pounds. Oh, and the Kinzhal is believed to be nuclear capable. The Dark Eagle isn't. So the US still has a long way to go before it achieves true parity with Russia and China on the hypersonic front. However, the fact that it now has a hypersonic missile at all is still a potential game changer for the same reason that these types of missiles are so dangerous in Russia's hands. There are no known air defenses that can stop the Dark Eagle, assuming the missile lives up to its current billing. If anything, Russia may be worse off than the US when it comes to the air defense front. Attrition of equipment has been a major problem for Russia during the Ukraine war, with Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claiming that Russia has lost 1,261 anti-aircraft warfare systems in the Ukraine war as of December 15th. Having fewer air defense systems isn't ideal for a country the size of Russia, which is already a major plus for a hypersonic missile threat that seems to have been designed specifically to hit Moscow. Also not ideal is the fact that Russia's air defenses have proven themselves inadequate against US weapons in the recent past. When the US carried out a series of airstrikes against Iran during the summer of 2025, it did so in the knowledge that its missiles would face a mishmash of Russian air defense systems installed on Iranian territory. America's coordinated assault using missiles that are far slower than the Dark Eagle put those defenses in Iran to shame. Russia is fielding some identical and similar air defense units on its territory, so there's no reason to believe that they are any more capable of stopping the Dark Eagle than they are the missiles that the US used in Iran. Of course, Putin claims that Russia has come up with an answer to the hypersonic question that the US now poses. Back in June 2020, the Russian news agency TASS reported that Putin claimed that Russia will be more than ready to counter hypersonic missiles by the time any of its enemies had developed them. They, hypersonic weapons, will be developed by leading military powers, but I think we'll be able to surprise our partners to the upside. There is high probability that when they develop such weapons, we will have the means to retaliate such weapons, Putin claimed during an interview. Russia claims to have followed through on Putin's promise with the unveiling of the S-500 Prometheus, which 1945 says was supposedly designed to be capable of hitting hypersonic missiles. But that system is untested against the type of missile that the US just revealed. Plus, Moscow's penchant for propaganda makes it difficult to trust any of the claims that it makes about its new weapons, defensive or otherwise. What seems more likely than Russia having a magical counter to hypersonic missiles is that the US has just developed a missile fast enough to evade Moscow's air defenses. Unfortunately for America, a downside exists, and it's one that we hinted at earlier in the video. Dark Eagle may be capable of traveling massive distances very quickly, but its meager warhead means there are still plenty of questions about the missile's lethality. Those questions have existed since at least February 2025, which is when TWZ reported that the Pentagon was unsure of just how powerful its new missile could be based on the limited data that it had available. The annual report by the Office of the Director, Operational Test and Evaluation highlighted the issue, as it stated that the Pentagon isn't able to make an adequate determination of AUR lethality, before adding that uncertainty in weaponeering tools could result in excessive employment requirements or failure to meet warfighter objectives. So there are two possibilities. Either the US hasn't ironed out the firepower kinks, meaning Dark Eagle hits hard enough to make it viable, or America has a missile that can fly far and fast, but has yet to pack the kind of punch that will make it a true concern to Russia. Confirmed use of the Dark Eagle against a target is the only way we'll discover which of these possibilities reflects reality. And it's unlikely that the US is going to reveal much more until it's certain that Dark Eagle is as damaging as it needs to be. As America's hypersonic missile development campaign takes a massive leap forward, Ukraine is making strides of its own. Now, Ukraine doesn't have hypersonic missiles, but it has a domestically developed ballistic missile that is used against Russian targets. Find out more about this missile, its deployment, and what it means for the war in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of America's most advanced weapons. And thank you as always for watching.